reimagining infrastructure with us as our first panel for today. With me, I have Tyler Duvall, the CEO and co-founder of Cavnue, a company focused on accelerating the full potential of connected and autonomous vehicles to make roads safer, less congested, shared, and sustainable. Next to him is Danielle Kochman. She is the Mobility and Innovation Planning Manager at the San Diego Association of Governments, SANDAG, a metropolitan planning organization, where she will talk about the work that she does on planning and deploying new programs, services, and pilot projects that leverage emerging mobility services and technology. And next to her is Allan, the Chief Legal and Public Affairs Officer at Flow, an EV charging infrastructure and manufacturer based, I think, in Canada, but they are opening up a facility in Michigan, which we will talk about as well. And then next to him is Harout, Chitilian, who is the Vice President of Corporate Affairs, Development, and Strategy at CDPQ Infra, which is a principal contractor for major public infrastructure projects throughout the world, actually. So as you'll see from these bios, we have today, when we talk about reimagining infrastructure, we have the governance piece, we've got the technologist, and then we also have the implementer on the contracting side. So I'm going to just start out, we all know that we're living in unprecedented times, right? If the infrastructure law is any indication, our governments are making major investments in infrastructure and thinking about not just transportation for transportation's sake or housing for housing's sake, but for the first time we're thinking about the interconnectivity of these various issues and how we can deliver them in a more holistic, complete way. So with that, I would love to start with Danielle to talk about why we must reimagine infrastructure today.
All right, so this is working. In my role, I work a lot with innovation and how we can deliver projects in new ways. And like everybody knows, we don't just innovate for innovate's sake, right? We live in an environment where it's becoming increasingly complicated to deliver transportation projects. And we have really ambitious goals because we have difficulties with congestion in San Diego, but throughout the world, real peak period congestion. And also, climate, we need to address climate change as well. And in order to do that, we need to start thinking in a multimodal way. People that are younger are more willing these days to live a multimodal life where they, not only need to drive their cars, but, will take a scooter to work and then an Uber to lunch. And our infrastructure isn't set up in a way to really accommodate that type of lifestyle. And as we see emerging technology and new modes of transportation, that's also something, where we have the same, infrastructure design of streets and highways that we've had since, the car was invented. And now we have, different scooters traveling at different speeds and different neighborhood electric vehicles and all sorts of people that are using these roadways that really aren't designed for them and aren't designed to accommodate also, one more thing, different users. I will say I'm the slowest scooter driver. I should not be driving with other scooter drivers. I'm like, but it's like, how do you start thinking about that, about different users and how our infrastructure can be safe and accommodate everybody?
So infrastructure that meets users where they are. I love this. Tyler.
Yeah, so I think, building on Danielle's comments, there's two basic trends that I think are driving us to need to reimagine. First is what she mentioned, which is the transformation of the vehicle platform. So, you have this wave of innovation in this parallel universe in many ways to the infrastructure conversation around vehicles. Obviously, the auto industry is driving a lot of that. You see, in the shared mobility space in urbanized areas, huge innovation in that. And all of that innovation is being done, frankly, independent of policies around how we operate, manage, and deliver infrastructure. And so I think, this parallel universe that we've been running in for, now 25, 30 years is about to get acutely problematic with these vehicles coming into market and nobody, frankly, on the other side of the equation really systematically dealing with that. The other reason, independent of that vehicle innovation, is that, we are kind of at this point where we, particularly as a comment about North America and Western Europe largely, where we built out dramatically after World War II. The performance metric was miles of track, miles of roadway, number of vehicles, all supply side metrics around, you know, these, how much we built, how much we supplied. And, you know, now the question is, you know, we had a fairly substantial response in North America and Western Europe to that, with all the environmental laws and all the planning requirements coming into place in the 70s and 80s. And now we're kind of like at this moment where, like, all right, we have all this stuff, but it's not optimized at all. And we haven't used technology sufficiently to operate these assets. And all of the other network utilities, you know, you look at, you know, electricity, telecommunications, technology has been driving into those networks to optimize efficiency and, you know, frankly, reduce costs and in lots of different ways. And we just haven't had that revolution yet in infrastructure at scale. But now we can. So the mix of these two mega trends, like, we kind of got to do it differently now. So.
Can I add one more thing?
Sure.
What I should have started with is, you know, our transportation network is constrained as it is. We don't have right-of-way to expand. You know, there's, you know, opposition from environmental groups from expanding our transportation network, which is well-founded. So how do we repurpose what we have to make it actually work? And that's where we're at.
Innovation within constraints. I love that.
Me?
Yes, Travis.
Okay, so why it is critical to reimagine infrastructure from an air quality perspective and from an environmental perspective. There are really no clear pathways to achieving the objectives that we need to achieve for Americans if we can't reimagine infrastructure, because we have to be able to accommodate these changing technologies, and they are infrastructure dependent. But beyond that, the timelines and the dollars associated with infrastructure are both typically long and massive, respectively. And so if we don't proactively approach the infrastructure challenge, we're basically forcing everything else to slow down. And we don't have that time from a climate perspective, but also from an environmental justice perspective. So that's why I think it's critical.
Thanks for highlighting the urgency. Yeah, Harout.
Yes. So prior to jumping on the question, a bit of a background on me, on what basically got me here and allows me to have a critical view of this subject today. So I'm an engineer by trade, entrepreneur, involuntary retirement from politics. So I lost my third re-election bid in city council, and now an executive in infrastructure development. And I'll answer the question by also adjusting the title here. I believe we have to say reimagining public infrastructure. And I'll explain why. Because I was in the private sector out of university, and specifically in telecom infrastructure deployment. And it amazed me how fast the evolutions in telecommunications network capacity evolved over the years. So since 2005, when I entered the market, and now we've had 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G. The private sector has adapted. The private sector has also even revisited the model, financing models. They have multi-vendor network operators. They have now companies that supply even infrastructure on demand. So the companies, the operators focus on the retail, the marketing side. But on the other hand, the public infrastructure projects in some parts of the world, and North America being one of them, have not kept up with the pace of the demand. Demand of what? Having better mobility, demand of making better use of land, demand of meeting greenhouse gas reduction needs. So reimagining public infrastructure is not a luxury, it's a necessity now. And where do we start? That's the question. And in our organization, CDPQ Infra, we decided to tackle this in a very systematic fashion. So we're revisiting project development, so to streamlining the process, making it shorter, making it more resilient to political and public interference, streamlining the design phase, so making projects well adapted to the needs of the community, not overstretching projects, not understretching projects, because overstretching is very common. Sometimes local stakeholders and politicians want something that is maybe not necessary for the needs of the community, and then delivering financing, operating, and maintaining these things. So revisiting, reimagining public infrastructure is a need, and time is ticking.
Yeah, Yeah, and Harout, I love, there's a theme that you had mentioned, and actually you as well, Danielle, that when we think about reimagining infrastructure, one of the baseline considerations is land use, right? How do we use that public right-of-way? And I'd love to try to dig in a little bit more on what you mean by multimodal, because I think this idea that there's like multi-use, multi-purpose infrastructure is kind of the future, but I'd love for you to share out some examples, if you have any, with the audience. And anybody else who would like to jump in.
Maybe I could start by saying we're in mass transit infrastructure development. So mass transit infrastructure development, one of the objectives is to remove cars from the streets. So move more people with less cars. And by doing so, you create opportunities to reimagine the public domain. What does that mean? To have maybe better balance between space that is dedicated for cars, to active transport, to even public spaces. The other aspect of making better use of land is highways. So our project in Montreal has 3 different grade separation methods. So we have the traditional tunneling, we have the traditional at grade, but we are also making better use of residual spaces on highways to have elevated guideways run parallel to these highways. So making use of that land that belongs to the public authority that now is not servicing the community in an appropriate fashion.
I think technology gives us the ability to be more flexible in our infrastructure, so we can have managed lanes that, you know, are for carpool and buses at one time, and people paying tolls. Could be for autonomous vehicles, connected vehicles at other times of days, and for truck and freight at certain times of day. So there's, you know, really good opportunities to, you know, one of the things we've seen, particularly since the pandemic, is that travel patterns are changing more quickly and travel preferences are changing more quickly. So how can our environment adapt from day to day, week to week, year to year, and throughout the course of the day as well? So not only can we do that on our freeways, but thinking about our arterials and our city streets, flexibly managing the curb. You know, we see more demand than ever for curb space. So how can we begin to monetize that a little bit? Not to, you know, not as a revenue source, but like one of the things I will say is that like right now, the way the transportation system is priced and the way that people are paying for trips is not going towards our goals, you know, in this country or, you know, anywhere in North America. And, you know, that's something that we need to begin thinking about, is that right now we're subsidizing single occupancy vehicles to, you know, create more greenhouse gas emissions, you know, instead of encouraging alternative modes of transportation. And so, you know, thinking about how we reimagine our infrastructure and how we can begin to, you know, promote different modes, you know, the modes that we know today and the ones that are coming in the future, like advanced air mobility and things that, you know, we like to think about is we need to not only have flexible infrastructure that can be prepared for that, but also be appropriately pricing different services to encourage the behavior that helps us get to where we need to go.
This ties in well with what Cavnue's doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I mean, building on that, I mean, our roadways are the crown jewel assets of transportation, right? You know, city streets, arterials, and interstates or limited access highways. And, you know, we don't treat it like the crown jewel asset, though. We treat it like it's a, you know, dilapidated shed in the backyard, and, you know, we'll maintain it every 10 years, and, you know, hopefully it doesn't fall down. And, you know, but it's an operating asset, and I think that's the, you know, with all of this innovation happening around it, the vehicle side, the form factors for transit. I mean, this is a wave that we're in the middle of. We're in, like, you know, football analogy, Q1 of this wave, and, you know, the reality is that if we took a different approach and said, look, this crown jewel asset, if we operated it to accommodate this wave effectively, you could see significant improvements in throughput, reductions in climate change, you know, impacts. I mean, all of this is attainable through much more active management of that asset. And to this point, it doesn't require massive increases in right-of-way, double-decking roadways. It just requires optimization, thinking smartly about price signals, demand signals. But ultimately, it's going to require that the infrastructure be able to communicate data to these vehicles in a low latency environment to allow for this full optimization to be achieved.
Yeah, I love this question because I think it gets to one of the most interesting challenges of designing for new mobility in our area. And when you look at cities like Los Angeles, for example, what happens when the city of Los Angeles invests in new LED lighting? they free up some capacity at their lighting poles, and then they look around and say, well, what else can we do? How can we sort of stack value with some of our existing infrastructure assets to provide tools that people like? And so, you know, we like to think at Flow about value stacking and looking at ways to use things like the curbside more efficiently. So we developed hundreds of EV charging stations that can be integrated into lampposts here in Los Angeles, and those have been deployed all over the city to help people who can't charge at home charge out on the curbside. It's one example. There are many other examples of where leading municipalities and governments are starting to basically look at their assets, their infrastructure assets, and see how they can integrate new types of mobility, new types of charging options within them so that you're mitigating your costs and you're also providing value for more people. And I think that's a really big opportunity in this particular space as we're starting to understand the needs of the new mobility consumer.
I love this. And so we've talked about the role of technology and kind of optimizing our public assets. Now this question is going to seem a little self-serving, but what's the role of data, do you think, in optimizing our infrastructure?
You're looking at me like I'm supposed to start again. So back to what I was talking about with travel behavior changing. SANDAG, you know, we're required as a metropolitan planning organization to do our long-range transportation plan for the region. And what we did for so long was every 10 years, we did a travel behavior survey. Most recently, you know, we can collect really accurate data. People opt in, they download an app, we get all of their GPS traces, and then they answer surveys, like before and after each trip, like how did you get there, what was your trip purpose, and we get robust travel preference data. We found lately, these are really, really expensive for us to do, and we have found in the last few years that the data is stale by the time we collect it, because everything is changing so quickly, and we really need robust data to inform all of our planning decisions around, you know, the investments that we make in our infrastructure and how we operate our infrastructure as well. And so in this era when data is becoming more and more valuable, you know, we're not able to necessarily generate it ourselves reasonably anymore because the speed at which it's changing, it's not bad. We live in a world of data, and it makes everything great. I love, and I've said this before on a panel, but that I don't need to go shopping anymore because Instagram will always tell me what I want. As a single mom, it saves my life over and over. I'm like, oh, I don't need to go to the mall. Like, just scroll for like 10 minutes on Instagram.
You made a really good point, right? March 13, 2020, like every travel demand model in the world kind of
exploded.
Became obsolete. Yeah.
Yeah, so look, I mean, there's the strategic value of data, which Danielle and other planners are looking at, and then there's the operational value of data, and that's what our company's focused on. There are three major drivers of problems or disengagements for advanced vehicles. One is the civil configuration. Roadways are not designed for these advanced vehicles. The second is operational problems, like, you know, including like light maintenance problems, painting, striping, clearing accidents, clearing debris, et cetera. You call it the operational platform is not designed to accommodate these vehicles. And then lastly is just data off the roadway, and that's why I refer to like low latency data that is actionable by these vehicles. They effectively have decided, most of these manufacturers of advanced vehicles, that they're not going to get any of those three solved because government is not focused on it. We believe they will, but they, you know, effectively are designing information systems and operational models for themselves, assuming no data will be coming off the roadway. And we just think that's just a statement of, hey, can government kind of work with the private sector to solve this problem? We think they can. And so if you target those three, data is obviously the most important over time of those three interventions. But yeah, I think the data streams off of a smart road network will help operationally, but then long-term can help planners really transform the whole way we operate roads to begin with. So.
And the user experience, you know, which is really key.
Data is key. When you're making billion-dollar decisions on investment projects, one of the most important phases is basically feasibility study. And during feasibility study, the data that we look at very closely is projection of ridership. So projection of ridership to establish a revenue model and to see how the project can become financially viable, but also a projection of ridership to adapt the service to the specific needs of today, tomorrow, and long term. one of the major mistakes when I was in the public sector that public sector keeps on repeating is sometimes overestimating demand and developing certain things that far exceed the need of the community. And when you're developing mass infrastructure projects, over-exceeding demand translates to higher costs, and higher costs sometimes translate to projects not getting done. So for us, that part of data collection, analysis, modeling is key. Then we also use data to monitor public support, and that's something key in these projects because a lot of these public infrastructure projects have to get political buy-in, have to get stakeholder buy-in, and have to get citizen and community buy-in. And monitoring community support for projects with data is very important, and you can monitor that on social media, you can monitor that with polling, advanced polling. And last but not least, it's in the operations phase. So operation is key because a system, especially in transit, that is not fast, frequent, and reliable is a system that will not be used by the public. So monitoring the data, making sure that the service meets the ambition of the developing organization is key in keeping people engaged and committed to this service.
I'm sure we could all talk about data for hours because it is so fundamentally linked to the success of infrastructure. But some of the themes that I think are important as a private company, we need data from our government partners to be able to do our jobs, or from our utility partners. So for example, when we want to make an investment decision about charging stations, or when our clients want to make an investment decision about charging stations, we need to know what is the grid capacity in a specific neighborhood, because we're trying to overlay expected utilization, which we have as an operator of 70,000 charging stations, but we don't necessarily know what the grid capacity is, and we need to know what's available in terms of other types of roadways and civil works. So from our government partners, we need those data sets in a way that is sort of accessible at a large scale, particularly now that we've got NEVI and we've got these large investments that are coming from the federal government. Our government partners need data from us, and so do the utilities. So for example, I was having dinner with some colleagues from a utility last night, and they said, you know, we are trying our best to forecast load impacts 20 years into the future, 15 years into the future, and we don't actually know where charging stations are going. And of course, EVs are probably the single greatest change to household electricity consumption since the introduction of air conditioning, which in utility world is huge, right? I mean, so this is something where there is sort of reciprocal data needs, but there isn't always a willingness to share. Another example of where our government partners need data, they need to know that the investments they're making in charging and in other large infrastructure projects are actually getting value for money. So one thing Flow has been working at all levels of the US government is to encourage those who are funding, in our case, charging infrastructure, to set performance standards for reliability and then collect data to ensure that they're actually getting value for money. So, you know, these are some of the big data issues that we see in our charging industry.
No, I appreciate that. And there's the planning side of the data needs, there's the operational side, there's the community stakeholder, the input that you get, monitoring. I love, you know, not overspending, you know, how can we actually use our resources more efficiently? But another kind of through line of the comments that I heard from you all is that there's collaboration, right? It's between the private sector and the government to kind of generate that data, collect it, use it, whatnot. So I'd love to dig in a little bit further there, because it feels like we're all kind of working in this space around partnerships and what collaboration looks like in the 21st century to get this infrastructure reimagined. Would love to maybe start off with, Harout, you had mentioned you don't say public-private partnerships anymore.
No, we say public-public partnerships because we're all serving the same need, which is to improve the public space. And I want to get specific about that collaboration, because we cannot expect different results by repeating the same processes and the same approaches. In the case of CDPQ Infra, our collaboration with the government was on specific matters. Let's start with one. In all these major projects, land acquisition is an issue. Sometimes it can take months, years, decades, and the project in the meantime is stopped and waiting for the land to be secured for transit, for any type of project. So we worked with the government to basically revisit the legislation around land acquisitions and that concrete collaboration. Second is environmental consenting. It's a must. You have to have projects that are vetted and that have to meet all the environmental standards and the ambitions that we have now and for the future. But at the same time, the length and sometimes the delays in these processes cannot become a way to slow down or even stop a project. So that legislation was revisited with governments. And last but not least is how to monetize. So we spoke about monetization of the public space. In our case, it was a taboo in Quebec to expect a revenue from developing infrastructure from property owners. So let me explain myself. So anytime an infrastructure gets built, especially mass transit infrastructure, people who live around it have an uptick in their value of their properties. And people who develop in those areas have also added value to their land. But how do you capture that? So we work with government to put in place a mechanism of land value capture. It was not easy, it was not fun, not for us, not for government, but now it's in place. And that in the future will serve as a tool to fund these projects. So I gave you 3 concrete examples of collaboration, but again, you have to have the will and you have to also be resilient because a lot of these collaboration outcomes are not very easily achievable.
No, that's actually really a great point. We'll get back to land value capture. It's one of my favorite topics. Danielle, you want to?
Yeah, I think, really one of the opportunities around P3s is how we prepare ourselves for technology. We've talked about up here that, the public sector doesn't deal well with evolving technology. We are always going to be slow. And looking at long-term partnerships with the private sector can allow us to, have these performance-based agreements, and allow the private sector, which is able to pivot much more quickly, to choose technology, to help meet those goals and performance metrics that we set. So we no longer need to go through these kind of cumbersome public processes, and we can be technology agnostic, which is, I think, a place where government wants to be. Technology isn't something that we're good at, and we should stick to the things that we are good at. And so that's a really good opportunity as well. And I think, talking about value capture, I'm sure at some point we'll talk about IIJA, but one of the biggest problems in my opinion is we've talked a lot about shifting infrastructure from a capital model to operating, and the federal government hasn't seemed to really kind of figure that out yet as far as kind of the path forward, and so there's still just huge discretionary capital grant programs are kind of the majority of the infrastructure bill as far as transportation. And that doesn't serve us in the direction that we're going and where we're starting to look at infrastructure as a service. We need to think about how our funding sources can, fund long-term operations of our existing infrastructure as kind of a transportation improvement. So looking at kind of the multimodal thing, which is something that I keep coming back to, and I mentioned earlier how everything needs to be properly priced, we can think about those same theories, with value capture. Because we don't have, kind of the operating support from the government that we need, we do have lots of opportunities with value capture. Within our transportation projects, we have, land that is very valuable. We also have a lot of broadband digital infrastructure, and we can work with internet service providers to, capture value on the conduit and broadband that we lay as part of our transportation projects. Electric vehicle charging, there's an opportunity there as well. So there's really kind of a lot of opportunities that we can capture value that is generated as a result of our transportation infrastructure projects and use that to private finance the project and make things happen. I think that's really, we're in this boat where it's just so hard and takes so long to make projects happen that, these P3s really make it a possibility.
Yeah, so I think I'll just assert that procurement or purchasing in the United States anyway, not true everywhere, is fundamentally broken in government. So the way government purchases services, technology, or capital assets is highly ineffective, does not induce innovation, takes way too much time, and frankly is leading to a lot of the outcomes. Now, procurement's not a topic that people like talking about. It's like, well, go talk to the procurement office. In the best performing organizations in the world, the procurement function is one of the most important value add functions. In government, procurement is viewed as a sidecar exercise that once the decision-making apparatus says we want to do this, we lump it over the wall into procurement. That is a huge problem, and is honestly at the heart of why we can't get innovation deployed more broadly in the United States in infrastructure. Similarly, when you look at these extremes of buying long-term partnerships through privatization transactions, those are largely financially driven or CapEx delivery driven transactions that have frankly not lived up to the hype. The thought that this would drive a lot of innovation has not borne out in my experience. And on the flip side, government buying isolated technology or services for one-off problems has not worked either systematically. So our view at Cavnue is that we need a new partnership model basically to unlock technology, particularly in the road space. In our business model, it's for autonomous vehicle unlock, but the theory applies broadly. And that partnership model should be longer term, performance-based relationships. Government should define outcomes that it wants to achieve, should force the private sector to integrate to provide those solutions. So if you're not the single provider of the solution, you find someone who is, and bring those answers to government in a systematic way. And then the contract should be structured such that as innovation happens in the private sector, the contract requires the private sector to constantly update, right? So EasyPass in the United States is the best example of a lock-in technology that was a really stupid decision in retrospect that we were trapped with for 25 years, right? That was a decision by a consortium of governments to lock that in the way they did. We can flip that script though, but it does require political leaders to engage in this question of not just what are we buying, but how are we buying?
Well, and then I think RFP design, this is again not a sexy topic, but what you are actually asking from your vendors before they respond, even before you get to the contracting stage, right? Are you looking for somebody who is well entrenched, you know, that can provide whatever the insurance requirements might be, or, you know, the financials and whatnot? Like, how does it work for startups like Cavnue or Flow in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, it's brutal. I mean, I'll just be honest. I mean, the time frames to deploy concepts that are readily deployable is, you know, leads to significant costs, leads to, you know, frankly, an underinvestment in innovation and overinvestment in the drag on that process. And I think, look, I think governments need to wrestle with the platform approach. Now, it's an experiment. I mean, the reality is governments have broad authority to experiment in these areas. You know, SANDAG is obviously one of them that's doing it, but, you know, set up experimental approaches to purchase, do pilots around that deployment, and then use that to scale. I think that's the only way. I mean, you're not going to break the model overnight. It's going to take, you know, a sustained effort, but I would start with defined experiments, defined outcomes, and then use that to drive change and acquisition.
That's great. Travis?
I was just going to quickly chime in that my procurement department thinks I'm the biggest pain in the butt, and I think that that means I'm doing a good job.
Badge of honor, right?
That's what I'm supposed to be doing.
Yep.
So partnerships, I think, you know, one of the things that can really scupper an infrastructure project, and I think Harout was talking about some of that, interacting with community groups, I feel like can really make or break some of these. We worked with NYC DOT and Con Edison to deploy curbside stations in all 5 boroughs of New York City. And as you can imagine, New Yorkers have strong views on things, but they also really care about their communities, they care about the urban design, and they care about how things work for them practically when they're walking or moving through the city. And, you know, I think some people would have found that that project took a really long time to deploy because they really wanted to do consultation with community groups. But our view and their view is that we are, in that case, like taking space on the curb. And so we need to be very careful that we're doing that in a way that isn't unnecessarily disrupting people and is providing maximum benefit for the folks that want to drive. And so what I took away from that project, because they have been very popular, is that sometimes that first consultative step, doing that in a very authentic way and doing it in a consistent way, can really lead to the kinds of broader acceptance of these projects that will allow for greater scaling later, but it does require you to have a longer term perspective. So that's one partnership that I thought worked really well. The other one that I find really exciting, there's an agency called the Canada Infrastructure Bank that has just launched a funding sort of program, and they're trying to target $500 million of charging infrastructure through a sort of modified procurement project finance vehicle. And what I like about that model is they basically did a lot of discussions with the market and leaders in the market, and they said, what are the major challenges that the private sector is having in scaling deployment beyond pilots and RFPs and smaller scale? And the major challenge that people saw was utilization risk. So lenders are concerned about lending against large projects because they're worried nobody will use the stations. And so CIB stepped in and said, well, we want to catalyze broad private sector funding, and so we can come in and take that utilization risk in order to allow people to prove out projects and then work with commercial lenders to scale as the market matures. And I like that model. I mean, it's still very early and they haven't announced anything yet, but I like that model because I really do think they were targeting the issues that required some government support to enable broader change.
No, that's great. And we've talked about infrastructure as a project finance kind of delivery mechanism as well, and who takes on what risks, right? I think is an important piece of how we reimagine. You had mentioned the infrastructure law, and all of these kind of comments that you all have been sharing have kind of led up to what we see actually reflected in this federal legislation, right? It is, there is the collaborative piece, there is a consultation process with the community in certain areas, there is the desire to innovate, even though the procurement vehicles are still TBD. I'd like to maybe just dig in for each of you, like from your perspectives, whether you're in technology or in implementation or you're in, you know, kind of regional governance, what are you most excited about with respect to this infrastructure law and what it means for your day-to-day? I know I'm looking at you again, but you got the regional planning organization.
So I haven't seen more money yet. I think we were supposed to by now. It felt like we were supposed to by now.
I think in Georgia they have, just to be fair. Like,
Oh,
I think
good.
there's a reason for how the money's being doled out. Yep.
You know, so my first transportation authorization bill as a, I started in this field when Safety Lou was passed. And that was so exciting for me. I don't remember why at the time, but it was just like, oh, look at all these new programs they have. They have JARC, and they're thinking about, you know, things differently. And, you know, and now it's like we've lived through a couple infrastructure bills since then, a couple of stimulus packages. And, I mean, we're trending in the right direction, but I would like to see more. I would like to see more. You know, we have, you know, the Federal Transit Administration and FHWA putting out these, you know, programs focused on new mobility, focused on intelligent transportation systems. We have the SMART grant, I think it was due today. Yeah, due today. But yeah, I mean, so there are these continued discretionary grant programs that, you know, are growing in size and acknowledging new technology more, but, you know, for my day-to-day, it's not changing a lot, and that's why, you know, I rely on myself, you know, and my agency to find new ways of doing things, and that's why we're relying on these, you know, partnerships with the private sector and with other public sector partners to make things happen. And so, you know, I applaud the direction things are going. We need to do more, but I think that, you know, need to also help ourselves and, you know, solve these problems on our own. So I don't know if I'm just a little bit disenchanted after, you know, years of
To be continued, yeah. For the companies, the private partnerships, or yeah.
So we're two Canadians on the stage,
I know.
and we have also the Consul General that's in the room, and we have representatives from Ontario and Quebec. And you asked how we feel about the legislation, and we're very motivated because we have Canada and US, the largest commercial partnership on the face of the earth, the most peaceful border on the face of the earth, and now we have common challenges in delivering infrastructure to reduce our greenhouse gases, to create sustainable economic development, to create better jobs in our communities. So as Canadian institutions, we're excited to see that legislation in place, and we're also very humbled to be able to support regional governments, cities, states in delivering some of these projects. So we want to be part of the solution. So us being here today, us being in all these different conferences is signaling that we are excited to see this legislation in place, and we're motivated to be part of the solution. What that implies is to be determined. Is it in financing some of these projects? Is it in delivering expertise for some of these projects? Is it in some instances, just advising on some of these projects? So we're here, and we're excited to be part of the solution and help you guys deliver all on these objectives.
No, look, I see the Honorable Polly Tronberg here, who probably wrote the law, so I think it's amazing, actually, in every way. It's absolutely perfect, Polly. No, so,
Good save.
so no, in all seriousness, obviously it's a great advancement on multiple fronts. More resources, always good. I think, obviously, discretionary grant programs, which were, when I was in government, was the first time we had them was kind of a fluke when the Senate, the Democrats took the Senate in 2006. That was the first time, actually, in probably 40 years that there was actually really substantial discretionary money outside the New Stars program. So that was the beginning of a trend, and obviously there's substantial discretion for the department here, which, my only advice to the department is, again, think not just about the what on the projects, but the how they get done. The department has tremendous ability to influence how state and local governments deliver these projects, how quickly it happens, what the outcomes are. Obviously, there's huge focus and churn around developing the concept of the project. So the other thing to just be aware of is that consumes time, and people shift focus to just build the process to write the grant, which could be beneficial because you crystallize an idea at the state or local level that then can obviously go forward, independent of whether the feds fund it. But I just, my advice to the USDOT team is, in executing this thing, really focus on how stuff gets done, not just what.
No, that's really important, but I also want to just highlight flow and kind of the work that you're doing and what the infrastructure law has kind of encouraged you all to do.
Yeah, so we were very pleased to cut the ribbon on our new Auburn Hills near Detroit assembly and advanced testing facility. And that's really exciting for us because we wanted to be really at the heart of the global automotive industry. We work a lot with the large OEMs, and we're very encouraged by what they're doing and the investments that they're making, and we wanted to be there. Because even though everything's standardized, you still have to test every charging station against every new vehicle, because one designer makes one little tweak and then people can't charge. And so it is really meaningful for us to be there. But more importantly, that was enabled because this sort of package of funding has allowed and encouraged the federal government to clarify its rules around Buy America. And let me tell you, those are rules. Like, you are dealing with really complex issues there, supply chain issues, regulatory interpretation issues, and it was kind of just chaos before because you had states that were making interpretations based on federal rules that weren't clearly articulated. And so what having some regulatory clarity did is it allowed for companies like Flow to make those investments. We're going to be building hundreds of thousands of charging stations there in order to allow us to meet the anticipated demand from some of these big investments. So it's leading to jobs, which is great. That's exciting. And I was thinking, Danielle, about your comment. We, of course, work with many different states, and I think there is a bit of a difference between California-based folks, because California, let's be honest, California is a global leader. And so folks like Danielle have been fighting and pushing on this for a very long time. Other people learn from them. But when we go to states that have not worked they're not quite as advanced, we are seeing a huge heightened interest in this funding, in having some revenue, in having money to devote to these programs and actually catalyze EV charging, for example, in our industry and other areas. And I think that is transformative, and we're really excited about it.
Can I add one more thing? Because I think this was where I was going, but I never really articulated it. The direction I would like to see is more integration within the funding program. So right now, there's car projects, is for that, and then transit, FRA has their own thing. And, I was on a listening session last week that they were talking about some freight program, and they were like, we're simultaneously funding the electrification of ports and the diesel expansion of ports. And so there isn't kind of that really integrated approach to it all being one system. You know, these are individual projects, and EV charging is separate, and resiliency is separate, and, you know. So I think beginning to really think about funding our transportation network as one whole, and then we can talk about housing too, and land use and how that matters, you know, but I mean, it's a really big challenge, and I don't know that it's feasible to get there, but.
And I think that's why the discretionary piece is very important, right? It's not a one-size-fits-all approach that I think that we're recognizing in this legislation. And it's like, you know, how San Diego region is doing it might be different from upstate New York and the like. So I don't know, you were.
Well, yeah, just building on that, I mean, there's always a lot of celebration for the number of applicants to a grant program. I actually always took the inverse view, which was a smaller number of people doing really hard things is actually a better metric for effectiveness, particularly in a subcomponent of these programs. So you can, you know, the feds can unlock state and local political inertia and conflict through these programs. And, you know, so I think obviously there's going to be a broad swath of programs that will just kind of run, but I think a subset of those could be used to really unlock kind of this integrated new concept for, particularly in our world, for roadway operations, but applies to transit as well.
No, absolutely. And actually on the integration side, I thought you were also going on the financing piece of this. And this is where I want to talk about land value capture for just a couple of minutes, and then we will open it up for questions. And we do have Gabe Klein, who heads up the Joint Office, and Secretary Trottenberg here from the US DOT. So maybe we can just have, you know, a conversation kind of around what does IIJA mean for reimagining infrastructure. But you had, I guess, talked about land value capture a little bit, and you talked about grants and how they don't cover the operational expenses. Are you seeing some innovation in the financing space, right, to think about grants and then how you kind of turn that into a value capture model where you then can reinvest in the communities?
So maybe some details of the land value capture mechanism we put in place. So we addressed it on two levels. So there is, like I mentioned, uptick in value of existing real estate. So that was captured, and there was a mechanism put in place to translate that to a dollar amount, for which we integrated that dollar amount into the project financing. And the second is trying to project and be a partner in future development. So in that case, we put a 50-year horizon, during which every single square footage of real estate that gets developed around a certain radius of these stations of this light rail system will pay a certain fee for development, but in the return for that fee, they are getting a state-of-the-art public transit system. So pushback was very hard, but the system is not even in operation. So it will be in operation as of next April, the first part, and we have already exceeded our projections that we plan to do in terms of land value capture over a 50-year period in the first 4 years of development. So developers initially resisted, the community resisted, but everyone realizes that mass infra projects are good for the community, and then they're willing to pay and develop. So that's one aspect. The other aspect that we didn't get into is that in terms of value capture is greenhouse gas reduction. So modal shift is important. Everyone talks about modal shift, getting people out of their cars and into mass transit. So we have not yet at this phase in our project established a value on that. We know how many tons of greenhouse gases we're going to save on a yearly basis as far as the data and the projections. But what that translates in terms of dollar figures of emissions saved is yet to be established. But that's very important too from our perspective.
EIFDs, are we going to go there?
Yeah, in California, we have the opportunity to enhance infrastructure financing districts. There's been a few that have been successful. We have one in the San Diego region, in Otay Mesa, that ours can be a partnership between the city and county, but don't have to be, so we're hoping to be able to leverage that mechanism towards more mega projects. We've seen success in the Bay Area with Transbay Terminal. And so, yeah, there are opportunities to capture value on land. I think it's being done better in some other countries, and I'm hoping that we can learn some things from international examples that we may be able to incorporate to build some of these, mega projects. And transit.
Yeah, one of the things I'd say just generally about the infrastructure finance market today in a call it an escalating interest rate environment is that as an asset class, it's expected to perform actually significantly better. It's generally speaking going to be more inflation protected asset class. So relative values get hit when rates go up, but when you look across different asset classes and say, civil infrastructure actually I think will perform a lot better than other competing assets. And so it is actually a really good time. The dry powder, so to speak, from the pension fund industry, institutional investors is as big as ever, still there, and then the sourcing of projects is as bad as ever. So you still have this huge imbalance, a lot of capital sitting there. That's why kind of fixing this acquisition problem will unlock huge amounts of capital into the space. And North America is way underdeveloped in unlocking this capital. So there is a moment here where, ironically, higher rates could actually create a new opportunity.
That's right, and I don't think people realize the municipal bond market in the United States is close to $4 trillion, and it has a lot of room to grow for the reasons you're stating. Okay, so I want to thank our panelists. We're not done yet. We actually wanted to open it up. We have just about 10 minutes left. If there are any questions from the audience, I don't know if there are microphones or how that is being worked, but I don't know, as we get that set up, are there any kind of parting thoughts you wanted to share with the audience on kind of the work that you're doing, reimagining infrastructure?
Maybe there's a question.
Good morning. So just love what I heard. Would welcome comments, if I could, on yesterday we were talking about infrastructure from a digital arena and the need for municipals to invest. And so, Tyler, I'd love to find out from you, given both the background that you're doing and your role previously at USDOT, does every comment you all make still stand when talking about digital infrastructure versus what has historically been a purely physical infrastructure view?
Yeah, so, I mean, the digitization of civil infrastructure is the breakthrough that we need. I mean, it is, obviously it's going to supply insights. We've got an entire software machine learning team now that we built from scratch in the last 2 years, from 0 to 30 people. The talent pool that wants to come into this space, which never would have been talking about technology and infrastructure, is out there. We're excited about the availability of software talent that's coming into the market. Not great for some of these big tech firms, but great for companies like ours that are like trying to build software capabilities in the space. So yes, the combination of a hardware platform, with radar, we can debate radar versus LiDAR, but we've got a camera platform with radar on roadways, has more visibility now than anyone's ever had around a roadway environment. The ability to crank insights around that is not fusion, it's not cracking the code. This is basic stuff for a lot of software and machine learning engineers. And so, this is a huge, next 5 years, we could digitize, huge swaths of our civil infrastructure in the United States to provide insights to people who own and operate that infrastructure, and then obviously to provide critical information to vehicles that are operating on it. And I think we need a dedicated national push to do it. I think state and local governments obviously can pursue projects, but I think this is a national imperative to optimize our civil infrastructure. The climate benefits are going to be substantial. The safety benefits huge. The throughput, I mean, everything that we say we care about in infrastructure and transportation can be achieved significantly through a digitization of those assets. I don't know if that answers the question, but absolutely everything we used to say about it, I think, is true, and everything, I think, today, where we are, it's the time. I mean, we've got the talent pool in the United States and North America to do it. We can attract that talent pool into the transportation industry. We could not have done that 5 years ago. If you tried to go attract talent from Alphabet, Apple, Facebook into transportation 5 years ago, you'd have been laughed out of the room. Today, we go into those, I mean, we hire every day now at this point. Like, they're dying to work on this problem. So I think this is just, let's capture it. We do need government to set projects out there for this talent to work on, though.
And I will just add, so at Replica, we spun out of Alphabet. We today, because I don't think people understand like the power of big data and like what is already here, not just the future. We are producing a national travel demand model every 6 months. So talk about the recency, and that's possible because of AI, machine learning, but also because there's software engineers who want to work on these problems.
I should have been big plug to them. They've been hugely helpful to our company. You all should look at them offline, but unsolicited big plugs.
Can I just add? I mean, not only is it transformative in the hard infrastructure arena, but like we're undergoing a utility energy system revolution, and one of the biggest challenges is that utilities need more data, and not just to predicting EV charging needs, but there's so many other aspects of this that they are essential partners to support. And so making sure that they have the capacity to both collect the data and actually use it, because like there's tons of organizations that are sitting on so much data and they're not using it properly, or they're not able to leverage it. That is also going to be, I think, very important as an enabling factor in the types of changes that others are talking about.
Capacity is a huge issue, yeah. I think I was talking to SFMTA last night. They have 1,400 vacancies, their agency. Any other questions? All right, well, maybe we can just do a wrap up then of like just what is reimagining as you think about your day-to-day work? What are some of the kind of best practices you might be taking back after this discussion?
Be prepared for anything. Everything's constantly changing and there's new ways of doing things, and it's just really exciting to hear from each other what's going on. Stay tuned for the project that Cavnue and SANDAG's working on. It's real exciting.
Excited. What's the timing on that?
Well,
Not putting you on the spot at all.
we're submitting a SMART grant today together, and we are going to board approval on working towards a pre-development agreement in January. That's the expected timeline. I'm in government, so I always have to say we are expected.
No, like my big takeaway is, I mean, government's got to get comfortable, try failing and improving. Like the model that has worked with innovation everywhere, it's broken through all these other network utilities, this approach to experimenting, failing, and improving. Like that mindset, we just have to be willing to do it. It's tough. Political environment where it's, everyone's looking to take cheap shots at everyone all the time, but, make your case, find what you're trying to achieve, find that there are downside possibilities that you may not achieve it, and be explicit about that, communicate that to the public that we're going to try different things, and then, connect to this world of innovation on the vehicle side that is going to change everything, but it will change it unevenly and inequitably if the government doesn't step up.
To his point too, messaging is just so important, and that needs to be one of the first things you're thinking about with, innovative projects.
My perspective and our institution's perspective, I believe that time is not a luxury that we have right now, so that's a given, and I sense everyone's sense of urgency in delivering these projects. But most importantly, money is there, expertise is there, intent is there, political ambition is there, but it's all about execution. And to execute these projects, we need to be agile in establishing the right partnerships, in establishing the right frameworks. And as an organization, like I said before, we're ready to all types of discussions to make those things happen.
My takeaway, and I love, Tyler, what you were saying about creating space to try and fail and improve. And I do really think infrastructure has always been about courage. Like, nobody has built big transformative infrastructure projects without having courage and being willing to deal with, frankly, some people who are suspicious or skeptical or scared. And so making sure to really have a vision and a holistic vision that's actually getting where we want to go versus what we've been doing, I think is critical. Supporting policymakers who are willing to go out on the edge and really push things, I think, is something all of us in industry can do. And then making sure that we're really communicating how these projects are helping important goals like equity and climate, and always bringing it back to that so that we're building the pathway for people to get to support.
No, that's so key, and I appreciate that, because I think what we started off with was talking about the why, right, for infrastructure. It's not just infrastructure for infrastructure's sake anymore, or for the automobile, right? It's really thinking about the community, why they are using it, who is using it, and how it can benefit, right, when we're connecting jobs, housing, and the like. So I want to thank all of you for your wonderful, wonderful comments. This has been such a pleasure.